So welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. My name is Christine Rinaldo. If you don't know who I am, feel like I've been here in my screen talking to you for almost like twice, 3 times a month by now. And I'm the director of the UCSF Rosamond Institute. But before we start today, I want to let you know, in case you missed it, we now offer the Startup Operations Support, which is a resource hub that connects startups, entrepreneurs like you with our partners. Some of the offerings that we some of the services that we offer ranges from legal services, bank account services, and one of the things that I want to highlight for folks out there who are interested in getting the company started, you do need to get incorporation services and getting the right service from their do it right for the first time is really helpful. And we partner with Wilson Sonsini and Brown and Rudnick. Wilson Sonsini is offering the incorporation services for free. So take advantage of that. And you can find that information by going to our website, rosamondinstitute.org/resources. And Arminio, I'm sure is going to send it via chat, the link. And also want to let you know that the 2022 Rosamond Innovators application is now open. As you can see, probably you've seen through our newsletter and our announcement that many of our prior year's innovators have benefited from this program, be it from getting access to early stage funding, in-kind services, and mentorship. And best of it all, that many of our innovators said, is that being part of this great community that are passionate about making an impact on improving the quality of life for patients. So our innovators have made great success by participating in this particular program. So I hope if you're interested, we can do the same for you. So check it out on our website, is that rosamondinstitute.org, and it's right there. And so let's get to where we are here for. I want to introduce you to our speaker today, Christine Mathews. And I talked to Christine a couple of months ago about the importance of people in executing a lot of the companies that you have in mind. So you develop the technology. At the end of the day, it's always the people who make it happen. And how do you ensure that the people that you have in place is aligned with the mission and the vision of your company? And also, how do you retain them? How you make sure that they're all happy and productive and help you deliver the goal that everybody wants to achieve. And so Christine has a lot of experience in that, and she had done consulting for a company like Grail, Ecogens, and Revance Therapeutic as well. And she also has provided high quality HR services to many of the small startups and company. And so she's going to share with you all the nuts and the bolts of how to make your people happy and deliver. And with that, Christine.
Thank you, Christine. I really appreciate you inviting me to be here today. And I'm glad everyone who's online has joined us. I'm Christine Mathews, as Christine Winotto said, and I have been for the last 22 years focused on startup companies in the life sciences arena. My first startup was a medical technology company called Novacept Medical Device. And that was in the year 2000. And I was employee number 42. And we took that company to 500 people over 5 years, and including 2 acquisitions on both sides of acquisition. So it was a crazy, fun ride. And after that, I knew that I wanted to stay just in the startup space and just in the life sciences space. So I started a consulting firm that delivered outsourced HR to startup companies. And that grew organically over the last 16 years to 65 people. And we merged into a nationwide company that does people services called One Digital last June. And I am now a principal at One Digital, focused on life science startup companies still, running an organization of about 77 consultants in it. And as I mentioned in our work, what we do is work with startup companies that are typically at the seed or Series A level, mostly in the life sciences space. And one of the things that I hear most often is, Christine, I don't even know what I don't know. So please give me kind of a landscape of what are all the things I should be thinking about as I'm building a company as it pertains to the people. And so last year, after having heard this so many times, I thought, I'm going to put together a slide deck and a talk that I'm now calling People 101 for Founders. And that's what I want to share with you all today. So I'm going to pull up my slides. Okay. So for the agenda, we're going to talk about all things people. And what this is going to be is an overview of the whole HR and people function. And I'll go through that with you in a little bit of detail. Then we're going to talk about launching a NewCo. What are those critical steps that you take first, second, third, and fourth when you're trying to get a little company off the ground? Third, building your team. A critical aspect of what you need to do to build a great company is to build a great team. Obviously, we'll talk a little bit about that, both in the early stages and in the later stages. Protecting your company. Compliance is really important. Just understanding the things that you need to do, the potholes that you need to avoid in order to really deliver, a good company and to not get in any trouble along the way. And then in the last section, I'll just share with you my suggestions for people best practices. Okay, so employees, as Christine mentioned, are the most critical link to a company's success. Like, you've got your technology, it's super critical. In the end, who's going to make that happen? It's absolutely the people. And who built the technology in the first place is the people. So we want to be sure that you know how to hire, motivate, and retain great teams. And so this is an overview that I've created of the people functions so that you can understand how it all works. There's a whole strategic component to the people services, if you will, and we'll go through this in detail on the next slide. And then beyond strategy, there's people operations and there's talent acquisition. And those are quite different, but very much integrated and the same into the same bucket of all things people. From a strategic point of view, when we talk about people strategy, what are we talking about? We're talking about what is the mission, the vision, the values of the company. Those are the things upon which you're going to build a great culture and attract great people. What are your corporate goals? What do you need to achieve for your board and to advance your technology into the world? Workforce design and planning. Now, let me stop and take a step back for a moment and say, when you're a tiny little seed company, a lot of the talk that I'm giving today is not going to be applicable on day one. But what I'm trying to do is give you a roadmap, like all the way through, so that as you put together even the most foundational pieces, you keep the big picture in mind. So something like workforce design and planning, when you're at the seed stage and you're only going to be 5 people or 10 people for the first 18 months or so, for example, you're not going to have to do a lot of workforce design and planning. But once you get into Series A and beyond, you're going to need to think very strategically about how you build your organization in order to optimize your success with your goals. And that's what I mean by workforce design and planning. And then compensation philosophy and strategy. That's very important. And that needs to integrate together with talent acquisition and together with talent management. How are you going to pay people? What's your philosophy? Is it higher targeted on equity and lower on base? Is it market on both? Where is it? What is it? And we can, we walk companies through that a lot. Talent management and assessment. This is the most competitive talent market that we've ever seen in my very long career. And so the way after we've found talent and bring them in, the way we manage that talent, the way we assess that talent has a big role in how well we can retain that talent, right? So that's an important component of a strategic HR program, if you will. Leadership and management development. The number one reason that people leave organizations is they don't care to work for their manager. So having strong managers is a really important success factor. And then strategic business partnering, which doesn't really come into account till you get a little bit bigger. Taking a look now at talent acquisition. Talent acquisition has a strategic component to it. For example, like once you've built your workforce planning and design that we talked about in the strategic section, what is your hiring plan going to be? That's all done kind of strategically. And then the tactics of the talent acquisition side, the actual recruiting fulfills that strategy. Company branding. Who are you? Again, mission, vision, values, culture, locked in with that. Like, you know, how are you going to exhibit who you are and why you want to be a company that people want to work for? That's the branding piece. What is the candidate experience like when they're coming through work, you know, to consider working for your company when they have a lot of other options, in particular in this talent market? That's the candidate experience. And once again, I'm giving you a landscape view right now. You do not need to know all of these things when you're a tiny little seed, but it's good to know what you need to build in to get all the way into the future. Then what's your interview process and training going to be like? Comp matrix, same kind of thing we just discussed on the strategic component, and the analytics. How are you going to measure your success in talent acquisition with analytics? With respect to the tactics on talent acquisition, job descriptions and postings, candidate sourcing and screening, feedback process, background and reference checks, and teaming up with people ops to do the offer process. These are the roles that the talent acquisition portion of the people function play. And we'll talk a little bit more about these as we get into building a hiring process. Then people operations is really executing on the people strategy. It's the tactics of getting people on board, getting them oriented. If you have goal setting in place, getting the goals set, doing check-ins with them, making sure people have a really strong experience up front. When you deal with the tactics on compensation, participating in surveys that will give you great data, doing job evaluations and analysis using that data, and then building a total reward cycle that reflects the strategy that you've set. What HR technology do you need on board in order to, you know, run your business effectively? There's really 5 types of HR technology. There's payroll, there's benefits, there's applicant tracking systems for talent acquisition systems, there's performance management, and there's HR information systems. All those come into play. Again, not at the tiny seed stage, but you want to build toward this as you build a people function. Employee engagement, that goes back to your culture, mission and vision, and then how do you actually operationalize that within your organization? Benefits, what are you offering to attract people from a benefits perspective? And then administering those benefits as part of people operation, dealing with leaves of absence, and then dealing with all the compliance and all the policies and the state and federal laws that come into play with respect to people operations. And then in people operations, we also want to have training and professional development that comes from the strategic decisions around building and developing people. So that's a whole look right there at the people operations, the whole people function that we're talking about when we say human resources. Now let's talk about how that factors into when you're launching a new company. When you're building a company, this is sort of a step approach we've taken here on this slide. The first thing that you're going to need to do is get payroll set up and select your benefits. Because, for example, last night I was talking to a CEO who's just starting, and you know, he's got an offer letter, but he has no payroll, he has no benefits. He knows the next 3 or 4 people he wants to add. Those are his, what I call friends and family hires. So those people need to get offer letters. Those people need to get on payroll. Those people need to get benefits. That's how you start. You've got to get payroll and benefits set up first, essentially, together with the initial offer letters. Beyond that, you've got to think through some critical people policies. How are you going to handle time off for people? Are you going to do a flexible system? Are you going to do paid time off? Are you going to do vacation? There's lots of different choices and different ramifications with those choices. How many holidays? Which ones are you going to offer? You need to get through the things that will help you attract people into the business, even at the seed stage as you start to grow. Then there's some critical people policies too, like you must have sexual harassment policy in place, anti-harassment. You have to have training, some things like that, right? So you've got to get those critical building blocks in place early on. And then you want to think next about how are you actually going to go out and find, beyond those initial few friends and family hires, how are you going to get people into the building, into the company, and how are you going to have them have a good onboarding experience? Now, you do not need much startup companies do not need a lot of infrastructure. We recommend a very light infrastructure to help you get just enough process at each step to really be successful and organized, but not to choke out the sort of innovative stage that you're at the seed stage. But a light hiring process, a light onboarding process makes a ton of sense. Then thinking through what are your total rewards philosophies. Some boards of directors, even at the seed stage, want to see a whole compensation strategy and matrix, and they want to get it board approved. And then they give the management team the ability to go execute to that with the, established headcount that's been approved. Some don't want to do it that way. They want to do more market-based pricing and sort of stay a little bit less formal on understanding the market and building all the tools related to it until you get a little bit bigger. Either way is okay, but you do want to have a thoughtful strategy about how you're going to approach compensation, because you want to make sure that you're being equitable and fair to people as you hire them and across the organization internally as well. And then the talent management piece that, if you put together a NewCo tomorrow, by the end of, so the CEO, for example, I was talking to yesterday, a founder, by the end of the year, you're going to want to think through, like, did you give people goals? Goals are probably not very practical in most seed company NewCos. It's too much moving around, too much flexibility needed. So what I recommend is, at the end of the year, you want to have a touch point. If you want to give people any rewards, you want to link feedback to rewards in some way. And you can talk more than goal achievement about people's key contributions to the business. What were their key contributions to the business? What are their strengths? And what are their areas for growth? And that is a very light, simple talent management practice that is helpful for companies at all stages. Okay, let's talk a little bit about hiring your team. Now, when you are tiny, again, when you are at the seed stage and you're only going to get to 6 or 10 people, and you may even know those 6 or 10 people, some of them may be coming out of founder labs or for what I call friends and family hires with your executive team and bringing in their best people from their past 2 or 3 jobs. That's pretty common. So you may not need this at the seed stage, but really it's a best practice way moving forward beyond that to project your headcount needs. You've got to have goals, your company goals. Then you've got to take a look at what are the skill set of the people that you've already got. What are the gaps toward what you need? And then you build a hiring plan strategically that fills those gaps, and you design an organization accordingly. So that's kind of a strategic thought process for projecting your headcount needs. In terms of hiring talent, I love this quote. It's a heck of a lot, and I can tell you it's true as well. It's a heck of a lot easier to hire the right people to begin with than to try to fix them later. So it is well worth it to think through a good hiring process. Even beyond the first few people that you know really well because you've worked with them in the past or they're from the founder's lab, you really want to have a process that you have communicated in advance to people, and it can be a light process, but it's organized and it accomplishes the goals. Now, this shows the steps of kind of a more formal process. So it might not be till you've finished your friends and family phase that you build something like this, but it's important to know what you should be building toward, even at the earliest stages of a company's life cycle. You'll always want to have a job description, because that is what you're hiring to, right? There's also legal reasons and compliance reasons that it's a good idea to have, but mostly you want to have it because people all like to understand clearly what are the expectations for their roles. Now, I understand that when there's 5 people in the company, nobody has a job description. But when you start to get a little bit more formal, job descriptions are critical. And especially when you start to reach out to the market beyond your friends and family out into the open market, you must have a job description. And then you post that job. And then you've got to come up with a recruiting strategy. Are you going to be using agencies? Is the hiring manager going to be using LinkedIn and searching for these folks? Are you going to hire a contract recruiter? How are you going to find people? And then once you've found people, are you going to screen them in person, screen them on the phone? Who's going to be on the interview team? How many people are going to be on the interview team? The people on the interview team really ought to be picked carefully to have an important role with respect to that person. And that in a startup, very early stage startup, is easy because sometimes it's the whole team when you're 3 or 4 people. But once you get to 25 or 30 people, it should be those that are very clearly job related, and will work closely with that person. And then you want to talk to the interview team about how you're going to conduct those interviews. Is everybody going to kind of do their own thing? Or did you want to kind of divide it up and see, if each person could take a chunk to really evaluate some core competencies, then you come back together and put it all together as an interview team and discuss it. So those are the things to discuss. Are there going to be any, scientific presentations are very common. If you're hiring technology and engineers, a lot of times there's technical tests included in interviews these days. Those are much more valid ways of assessing talent than just having a conversational interview. So that is something to consider. And then, once some people do written feedback about candidates. I recommend interview teams meet together and talk. The only caveat on that is you have to avoid the group think when you're all debriefing a candidate together. I would have the hiring manager or the most powerful people in the room go last and try to really get candid feedback from people and set the tone accordingly. Once you've decided you've got your final candidate, then you want to do background checks and reference checks. And those are really important steps. Figure out who and how the offer is going to be prepared and extended. Sometimes there's an HR consultant there. Sometimes there's a recruiter there. Sometimes the hiring manager wants to do it. There's pros and cons to all of these different approaches, and none is right or wrong. But having a strategy up front, once you start making regular hires, helps you stay both organized, and it also helps you stay compliant because, and I'll get to this in another section, you are treating everyone equally who is going through your hiring process. So let me hold for a minute there and see if there are any questions before I go further. Christine, are there any questions?
Yes, there is one question. Are structured interviews the best practice?
Yes, I would say that structured interviews, and I think what you mean, the person who said this, is what I was just kind of describing, where you say, okay, these are all the core competencies we want to assess. So we're actually going to assign different people to different core competencies, or we're going to come up with structured questions that we're going to ask to each person to get at those skills. And I would say absolutely a structured interview. I'll tell you, the hard part about it is it takes a lot of time to create the structured interview and to prepare for it and to get people aligned around it. But it yields much better results in terms of being an effective assessment tool for a candidate. And in fact, let me cover a couple more slides, because I can keep talking about this when I get to the behavioral interviewing technique, which I think is critical to really understand, because it adds a lot of power to the structured interview sort of component. It's just important to know from a compliance perspective that when you're interviewing people and considering hiring them, you have to be very careful that you're not discriminating against anybody for any of these categories, for age, disabilities, equal pay. Like, that's a new law, especially in California in the last couple of years. Like, that's, you can't discriminate based on pay. Genetic information, veteran status, national origin or ancestry, citizenship, race or color, religion or creed, retaliation, and any kind of sex, gender, pregnancy, sexual orientation, gender identity. So please keep that well in mind. And once you become a large enough organization where you have people who are more junior and aren't sort of senior level, the first few senior level folks in the company interviewing, I would recommend training people, doing interview skills training and making sure people go through this and understand this. And also learn the behavioral technique that I'm about to teach you or refresh your memory on for those of you who've already seen it. So don't ask questions that have anything to do with any of those protected classes. Nothing about age, maiden name, native language, marital status, number of ages of children. You know, these are easy sometimes in interviews to ask about because it's kind of natural if people get into chatting about families. It can happen very naturally. And I've been in situations as the interviewer where I have to remind myself, don't ask. That person is bringing up their children, but you don't say anything because if it comes from them, it's fine, but don't weigh in. And also recently I was talking to one of our clients who has a last name that sounds like it's Hawaiian, and I was raised in Hawaii, and I almost asked him if his name was Hawaiian. And even though it's not, he's not a candidate I'm interviewing, it wouldn't be legal for me to ask him that question. I just think we have to be very careful to stay away from anything that kind of, when it's not a personal conversation, when it's an official business conversation, we just have to be careful. But what I'm trying to illustrate for you is that you can innocently get into a situation where it would feel very natural to ask some of these questions and don't. Okay, so about that structured interview, one of the best ways to do a structured interview on a micro level, and then we can talk again, I'll reiterate on the macro level, which I think the question was related to. On a micro level, you can really structure your own interview questions, even if the entire process isn't being structured formally, by using the behavioral interviewing technique. And it was developed many years ago. And I actually took my training from Paul Green, who developed it, I don't want to tell you, back in the 80s, I think, and or 90s, one of the two. And the idea behind behavioral interviewing is that past behavior predicts future performance. And so what you want to do when you're interviewing someone is you want to know what skills you want to assess. And then you want to create questions that ask them to tell you about times, real times in their past that they've demonstrated the skills that you want them to demonstrate on the job. So for example, if you've really got to have somebody who's leading a team, or say turning around a team, say it's a CEO turning around a team, you say, tell me about a time that you were able to successfully turn around a team that wasn't performing well into a team that was performing highly. Okay, and then you have to watch, because people will say, well, here's what I would do if I was in that situation. And you say, no, I want to know what you did do when you had the situation. And now if somebody hadn't done that skill, then they'll tell you that's a different conversation. But another example that everyone's done is tell me about a very important, deadline that you had to meet on a job, and tell me about how you met that deadline. Tell me about a time you had to work under tremendous pressure. What was it like? And, how did you cope with it? And people will, again, naturally want to go to the hypothetical, tell you what they would do. And, you just have to be very polite and direct them back. And what I do when I'm interviewing people, and I tell them ahead, I'm going to ask you to share with me real live examples of some of your past situations you've been in on jobs. And it's okay if it takes you a little while to think about the example. The silence is fine. I want you to come up with one that feels really right to you. So you have to allow the silence, because what happens is someone is going to actually go through. It's not easy to come up with a time that, you didn't do as good a job on a project as you wanted to. And what would you have done differently, right? People are going to have to sort through their database, their computer, their brain, to find the best example in the moment that fits with what you're asking. And then what happens is that they start telling you the story. And they start telling you who, what, when, where, why, how. And they can't screen that story fast enough as it's coming out of their mouth. And so you actually get the whole picture of how that person coped with and managed that situation. And it gives you a whole lot of data about who that person is. So if you And behavioral interview questions take a little while. So you can't get maybe more than 4 to 6 in an interview, depending how long it is. So you've got to pick your most important things that you would really want the person to demonstrate on the job. And this is not the technical skills, by the way. This is the professional skills. So judgment, decision-making, problem solving, leadership, all those, organization, those kinds of things. And come up with the 4 to 6 or however many, and then ask them. And so structuring that where you ask also those same questions for everyone who's interviewing for that same job is the most fair way to assess people, and also the most protective in terms of there's no discrimination. You're interviewing everybody, you're asking the same things, you're picking the ones that have the best answer. So one other note, so that's a micro structured interview. A macro structured interview is what I was talking about before, and what I think the person in the audience was asking about is a structured interview where you literally say, we're assessing these 3 different most important core competencies for this person. We're going to have Jane take these. We're going to have, Derek take these. We're going to have John take these. Then Jane, Derek, and John all make their own structured interviews and come up with their same data that they bring back to the team to share. And everybody's got good data that's assessing different parts of the criticality of the job, and you put it all together. And that is, to answer that question in a very long-winded way, that is definitely a best practice.
So next question, as an employer at a startup, how would you respond to your employee telling you that they have another job offer at another startup and want you to beat the offer?
I don't like these. So there's 2 things I would say. My first initial reaction over 3 decades of doing what I'm doing is that if you come to that situation, most of the time you've lost that person's heart. If
I agree.
If they're going to go find another job and they're going to treat a job like a transaction that way and come back and ask you to meet that, I think you've lost the battle. Counter offers, in my experience, only work for a very short time because money is really not something, in my view, money is something that you should take off the table so it's not an issue. But if that is the most important issue, you're never going to get the heart and soul of the person to be on that team, delivering passionately for the mission and the product and the company. And so in general, now the reason I am hesitating in any way is because of the talent market right now, and because of the fight out there to find and retain the best talent. So if this is your most critical engineer, or somebody who's, a clinical trial person, and you're about to, finish enrolling a trial, then you might have to just suck it up and counter offer them and lock them in for a period of time until which time they're not as critical to your business. So from a pragmatic point of view, it will depend on that person, on their skill set, on that role, and how critical they are to the company. But overall, if you can do without that person, I would just move on.
Yeah, I agree. I used to tell managers is that almost like once the girlfriend wants to kind of break up with you,
yes,
they found a new boyfriend already, don't hold on to them.
Exactly. Good analogy. Very good analogy. So who wants to be second best, right?
Yeah, I think they've moved on, and you should have given them the love when they are still with you, rather than given the love after they found another boyfriend. That's what I said.
Yeah, though, Christine, you saying that does, if that happens, I think it would behoove the company's leadership team to think about what are they doing or not doing that is creating a great work environment. And not to say that that could just be a one-off, and could be just that person is built that way. That would be for sure a possibility. But you want to make sure not to lose the opportunities to dig in and see, are we doing everything we can to create a great place to work? Do we have a really good culture? Are the managers engaging and challenging their people and developing them? Because if you're doing everything you can to create a great company and someone does that, then that's just them. but you want to make sure that you are really doing, controlling everything you can to make it the best darn place to work it can be.
Right. So do you want to take a couple more?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, perfect. How are equitable compensation practices managed when there are key operations in more than one country?
Oh, that's a hard question. So I think what has to happen if you have key operations in more than one country is that you've got to have somebody globally looking over the compensation, from the very top level, right? It's interesting because, and you have to really dig into this because different countries have different ways of compensating people. Like, Europe has, we do in the US, the medical benefits are provided by an employer and the retirement benefits are not. Well, in Western Europe, it's the opposite. The medical benefits are not, they're provided by the country largely, and then by private plans, and the retirement benefits are provided by the employer. So you really have to take a look at total compensation and country by country, who's getting what, and make sure you feel comfortable that you have good practices that are equitable globally as a starting point. And then beyond that, I don't think it's difficult. Beyond that, what I recommend as a best practice anyway is to do what's called a talent review of your entire company across the whole, leadership team and across the entire organization once a year. And you make sure that way that you don't have leaders within the company managing their talent in silos. Like, this is my talent and that's your talent and that's your talent. And if you do that, you have the possibility that people are being treated inequitably between teams, but you also lack the ability to own the team completely as a leadership team and make sure that it's our talent. And so you've got to have a leadership team looking over that multiple, different key operations and making sure that there's a talent management process that ensures that the top performers are getting rewarded accordingly in every country. And, that there's a look across the entire talent base.
Okay. Last question before you move on to continuing your presentation. How to attract co-founders versus first founding team and staff at early stage with very limited budget, and how to look for the right compositions of founding team, and how to plan for share or incentive distribution.
Okay, that's a really big question. So the first part of it, I think, was you've got a core founding team and you want to look for additional co-founders to join it.
I think you want to also attract the early stage staff to join with limited.
Yeah. Well, in my view, as I sort of alluded before, if typically what I see, all I can tell you is what I see is that, typically you've got one or two or sometimes three co-founders that have come together to get something off the ground, kind of in the stealth mode to make sure that it works in the lab or in the, in an engineering lab or a wet lab. And then, what happens typically from there is that, those people attract their former colleagues or friends not friends, but who become friends, former colleagues and other associates from there to build out co-founders and to build out those early stage hires. That is almost always what happens. Now, sometimes founders don't have the networks to do that. And in that case, we help people recruit, right? Like you have to go out into the market and you have to really figure out what your value proposition is early on. If you're recruiting for a stealth company that's in very early stage mode, like a seed stage company, that's harder because it's a fantastic opportunity on one hand to get in the early days. It's a high risk and it's perceived as a higher risk and less known organization, obviously. And so you really have to go out and do quite a bit of outreach to find the right people. And then you have to get the leadership to do a lot of that recruiting. So in other words, the recruiter is going to do a piece if you've got a recruiter, but you've got to get the CEO, co-founders out there really saying, I want you to be part of my team, and here's why, and here's how I found you, and tap all their networks and make sure that you can attract the talent. So was that part of it, Christine?
Yeah.
That's a multi-layered question, but that's typically what I see.
Okay. I think the next follow-up question is how to plan for incentive and stock option distribution.
Oh, that's a complicated one that we probably can't talk
Right.
about. I'll give it a brief one. I mean, there's some pretty established metrics on, early stage ownership for founders. That said, the data, let me step back. The data for benchmark survey data, like on base and bonus in the life science, arena, is very well established for cash. Equity is much more variable, and it really depends, as you all know, on the cap table. And, if you've got founders that don't yet have VC funding, yeah, they've got high ownership, but then once you get a VC there, that goes way down. And so it just really depends upon the cap table and how that's been built. And so if we're helping companies with equity, what we do is take a look at what their situation is. Now, typically the companies that come to us are venture backed already. And so they follow some common metrics of, X percent. It's usually around 12 to 18% of the cap table is for the employees, right? That goes beyond the founders and beyond the VCs and beyond the board members and such. And that gets distributed, and you have to make sure that's going to take you to the next round of financing. And then you can divide it up and plan for your hiring plan that we talked about earlier, and make sure that you've got a good stock ladder with percent ownership targeted at each sort of level that you're hiring people into. And I would recommend doing something like that very early on, building a good stock ladder, having a good part-time CFO on board to help you work with your cap table and make sure that you've got enough equity for all of your hiring needs. And then you can sort of see, where to put people within that context. And then there's some good market data from Radford and other companies on average percent ownerships at pre-series A companies, especially at Series A companies that have raised, say, under 40 million or 40 to 80 million. And so you can kind of get some good grounding on that. But I will say that equity is not a science. Equity is an art. And so it's important to look at your unique situation and get some experts like CFO and HR to help you with that piece.
That sounds great. Oh, thank you for this question.
Okay, now we get into protecting your company. And one of the things I want to say before I get into this section is I don't want to scare you all. I want to tell you that you have very little risk, I think, in the very, very earliest stages of being a seed stage company. It's really much more, though, that I want to give you an overview of all the places that you can go wrong as your company grows, so that as you grow a company, lights will go off in your mind and you say, wait a minute, I need to get a legal opinion. Wait a minute, I need an HR person, so that you don't step in the potholes. But if you again, that whole thing of tell me what I don't even know what I don't know. I'm telling you a little bit what you don't know, hopefully now, so that you know it, even if you don't need it in the very earliest days. Now, the first key compliance issue that's really hot these days, especially in the state of California, is contractor misclassification. And that is, are you hiring people as consultants or are you hiring them as employees? And hiring consultants, and we'll get into this in the next couple of slides, hiring consultants, it's not really, if you're hiring an employee, if you're hiring a consultant and then planning later to convert them into an employee, that's not a consultant. That's actually a no-no. So we'll talk about that when we get into that slide. And we can talk a little bit more about all of that whole issue. The next one is employment classifications, salaried versus hourly. This is a little bit easier in the biotech industry because almost everyone is salaried. Almost everyone is sort of a highly professional, highly paid, employee. However, there are certain lab jobs, certain administrative jobs, et cetera, that by law are hourly, which means they require overtime. And it's very important to get that right, because if you don't, it can cost a fortune. Third is the EEO job-related hiring process and avoiding problem questions that we already covered. Fourth is immigration. Are you going to be open to hiring people who are immigrants and need visas? And if so, then do it consistently and get an immigration law firm on board, because this is not something that you can do on your own. And let me tell you, I have seen immigration cases be messed up, and you're messing with people's lives when that happens. People need to get deported when the immigration is not handled in the proper way. So immigration, if you're going to be open to hiring people who need visas to work in the US, which is a wonderful thing to do, then be sure you do it right. There are a lot of protected leaves of absence, both federally, but especially here in the state of California. So when you're building that NewCo, remember in the second ladder, the second step of the ladder I showed you, it says essential people policies. Do make sure that you get some support to make sure you get the right policies in place, or at least if you've got somebody who's pregnant or who's, you have deaths in the family, all these things, you do have to be mindful. There's quite a few protected leaves of absence. ADA is American Disabilities Act, and there's also California disability laws that are similar, that people may have disabilities in the workplace and we have to provide them reasonable accommodation. In addition to not discriminating against them, we have to provide them reasonable accommodation where possible by law. So it's just important to be careful about that. If you have somebody who's ill or unable to work, be careful that that's not related to a disability. And if it is, it needs to go down a whole different path than the normal attendance management process. Sexual harassment in the state of California is basically mandated training now for all companies over one employee, I believe. So you need to have training, you need to have a written policy right up front. That's one of those essential people policies I talked about as well. And if you ever have any accusations go on, you need to do a formal investigation. That's critical in order to be in compliance to defend yourself from any problems there. And so that's something where you would need HR and or a lawyer's support with that. And again, you guys are not going to have these issues, hopefully ever, and certainly not till you're much bigger as a company. But I do think it's good to know right ahead what the roadmap is and what the watchouts are. If anyone gets ill or injured in the workplace, that goes through workers' compensation. It doesn't go through the normal medical process. So it's very important to highlight that. There's required reporting related to that and a required whole track of managing those illnesses and injuries through a separate track. So it's important to get on top of that. And then when people leave the organization, there's some very strict laws around when they get their final paycheck. And we actually have one of our clients I just heard who who got penalized for not doing this correctly. So, payments at separation are a good time to get, HR legal involved to make sure that that is done correctly. Okay, consultant versus employee. Let's talk a little bit more about this. I'm not going to go through all of this. What I really want to say is that if you have a consultant, it really ought to be an independent business with multiple customers like our business, and not work as part of your regular company's business. Now, let me give my team as an example. When I was an independent, firm on my own, I had an attorney give me advice and say that nobody could be a 1099 consultant on my team who delivered any services to our clients, because that was the core of our business. I could hire a consultant to do my finance, to do my marketing, to do my IT, but not to do HR consulting, because that was our bread and butter. So that's one example. So my biggest counsel to all of you is that if you have someone, and it's tempting to do at the beginning, tiny startups do it all the time. And I also want to make sure you know that it is unlikely that you will get in trouble. That said, some of our clients have been audited, even as very small companies. If you want to hire someone as and it's, you think they'd be good as an employee, but you want to hire them temporarily as a consultant because, you know, you want to try them out, or you want to have them part-time to start. You don't quite have enough funding to make them full-time. All of these things are fine, but you want to put them on a third-party payroll, not as a 1099 contractor, because if they're classified as a 1099 contractor, the state of California doesn't get their taxes. And so when they go, then you convert them into an employee, and the state of California sees a 1099 and an employee in the same year, then they audit. That's when they audit, right? Because that doesn't go well. So there's 3 ways that you can pay people. And this is a really easy solution. It costs a little more money, but it prevents the whole issue. You can put people, when you're starting up a NewCo, on your own payroll. So your founders, your employees, your full-time people. If you have some people that you want to call contractors, but they're not businesses with, or vendors, you know, with their own businesses and highly independent and all of that, but kind of almost like look like an employee, then you can put them on a third-party payroll. It's also called doing a leased employee situation. And the big deal there is that they get a W-2 because they're payrolled by a third-party company. And, you know, the EDD doesn't care as long as they're getting their taxes, it's fine. It's the taxes that are the issue with the 1099. So what I do, I have full-time employees on my payroll. I have people I'm trying out or doing projects or working part-time on my third-party payroll. And I only have 1099s that are doing work completely outside of anything we do, or have their own standalone sort of shops, and they look like vendors. So that's my best advice for the consultant versus employee situation. And this just shows you that one miscalculation, if you get audited, it affects all these different boxes. So we won't go through all that. Okay, regular employee classifications. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. The Fair Labor Standards Act was put in place after the Industrial Revolution, when people were being so badly abused in factories. And so the idea behind that law was that, look, you can't work people 80 hours a week. You can only work them 40, and over 40, 8 hours in a day, 40 hours in a week, you have to pay them overtime at time and a half or even 2 times, so that they don't get abused, right? Factory workers and the like. Well, that law has continued till now. There's sort of differences between the federal and state laws, but it's still there. Bottom line, you know, people who are exempt from the law, that's what that means, are salaried people, highly professional, making decisions on matters of significant importance, right? And non-exempt workers are those who are taking instructions and have sort of transactional work. Think about the glass washer in a lab, or the trying to think in the clean room, the assemblers, right? Non-exempt, right? And those people who are doing very repetitive kind of work that somebody else is telling them what to do, how to do it, when to do it, they are entitled to overtime pay. Anything more in the state of California than 8 hours in a day or 40 hours in a week. And it's super important to get this right, because the penalties for not getting it right on a non-exempt worker are significant. Okay, I'm going to ask any more questions, Christine, because otherwise I want to finish for about 1 minute on the best practices slide. But if there's any other questions, I'll take them now.
Let's finish it up, because we only have 3 minutes left. There's a lot of questions.
Oh, okay, shoot. Sorry, I talked too much. Okay, my success factors I want to pass on to all of you as future founders of your own organizations. Think about your culture right from the beginning. You asked that thank you, the person asked the question about, you know, the counter offer. Like, just make such a great company that people love to work in it. That's my best advice. I've done that, and it really pays off. Value diversity, equity, and inclusion. Onboard people with impact. That's your moment when you're bringing people into the organization. You have that chance to really connect them with the mission, vision, values of the organization. Set clear goals and expectations. It may not be in the very beginning that you set very clear goals, but again, think about what I said about by the end of the year, what are your key contributions? But even if you don't have established goals right from the beginning in year one, you should definitely have them in year 2 and beyond. But create expectations for your team, create accountability for your team. I talked about this already. Build light and efficient process. Don't choke it down with too much process, but don't let it be chaos. Enough process to support the organization to grow organically as it goes along. Provide people growth opportunities, even in startups. I mean, a lot of that is on the job, right? Because it's wear a bunch of hats, but do make sure people are growing. Lead by example is huge. I can't say enough about that. It speaks for itself. And then thoughtfully engage and manage your talent. One more slide on, I think I actually have a couple more slides. I'm probably going to run out. Cornerstones of culture. What I want to just say about this is my favorite quote: customers will never love a company until the employees love it first. So build a company people love. Communicate openly, recognize publicly, and coach privately. Foster teamwork, encourage regular feedback. We could have a whole nother talk about that. Lead by example, I've already said. Empower your employees. Okay, in the last minute, I want to spin through DEI, which I really should have put up front further in the conversation. This is a very, very important component to creating a good people environment and a good people company. I want to say that diversity asks who's in the room. So diversity is getting enough diversity in the door into the company. Then that's not where it stops. Then there's inclusion, right? And equity responds who's trying to get in the room but can't get in the room, right? And then inclusion asks, have everyone's ideas been heard? So I like that. And then operationalizing DEI, talent acquisition. There's a lot of, we don't have time to go through all this now, but good job descriptions, inclusive language. Think about DEI for assessing and promoting people, and think about it again for benefits in workplace. And then on the end is just always treat your employees exactly as you want them to treat your best customers. I ran right up against time, you guys. I really enjoyed this talk today. Thank you so much for attending. And thank you again, Christine, for having me.
Well, thank you for sharing your insight with everybody here.
Absolutely.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Thanks, Christine.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.